All right, well, that first panel was really great, and I know that many of you here, and myself included, are looking forward to this second panel. I'm Brian Franklin. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, and I'm very pleased to be able to help get this panel going. Allow me to, as with the first panel, to just give a quick introduction of our three speakers, and then just like in the last panel, after they've all had a chance to share their research, then we will open it up to any of you for questions. And as I told a couple of you earlier, we're all kind of hanging out here together for the day, so if we don't get to a question or if you're not comfortable asking one on one of these loud microphones, you know, find these scholars, find these people throughout the day. Most of us do not bite, so we'd love to talk to you. So in this panel, we're going to be looking at three more presidents, most of whom we do know a little bit more about in our collective consciousness than perhaps John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, even though for me as an early Americanist as well, that makes me sad. But these three are very well known to all of us: Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We will begin with Kathleen Dalton. Kathleen is the External Fellow in the International History Institute at Boston University. She is the author of Theodore Roosevelt, A Strenuous Life, which many historians consider the best one-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt that's out there. I've heard multiple people say that. That's saying something, because if you know anything about Theodore Roosevelt, you know there are a lot of biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. She's also working on a book about William and Caroline Phillips and their political friendship with Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. Today, she'll be focusing on TR. John Cooper is Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he taught for over 40 years. He's written and edited several books about Woodrow Wilson and his era in U.S. history, including The Warrior and the Priest, which is a comparative biography of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and a one-volume biography of Wilson himself. He's also worked relatively extensively on television biographies and documentaries of Wilson and TR, including advising for Ken Burns' series, The Roosevelts, and he was a member of the editorial advisory committee of the papers of Woodrow Wilson. And then third, we'll hear from Professor David Sahat. He is Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University. He is the author of a book that was mentioned briefly earlier, The Jefferson Rule: How the Founding Fathers Became Infallible and Our Politics Inflexible. And before that, a book, The Myth of American Religious Freedom, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, which is given to the author of a first scholarly book dealing with any aspect of American history. So these three will be joining us, and we'll begin today with Kathleen Dalton.
Hello. I want to remind us that Theodore Roosevelt was reputed to always want to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So today, what he gets is to be the founder of the modern presidency, the most prolific historian ever to serve in the White House, and to be a person who reimagined the nature of the U.S. nation state in foreign relations and also imagining a domestic welfare state. So in that sense, he's a significant figure in terms of history, not a bride or a corpse, but he's also, as you'll see in my talk, a little bit of a Lincoln wannabe. So my talk, in summary, I can tell you, the first part is the development of TR's historical consciousness, where it comes from, the nature of it, and the second part is how that played out in the presidency and afterwards. Early in his presidency, TR became president in 1901. He sought out John Hay for frequent Sunday visits. John Hay is an important figure in Abraham Lincoln's presidency because during the Civil War, John Hay was his young personal secretary. And then after he was there when Lincoln died, cut a little piece of hair from his head when Lincoln was dead. And John Hay then went on to write a biography, multi-volume biography with Nicolay of Lincoln, and become kind of the owner of the Lincoln spirit in some ways. So he was the Secretary of State when TR became president, and TR kept him in office. Also, TR looked at John Hay as a close family friend because TR, Theodore Roosevelt, forgive me for always calling him TR, it's a habit, and that is TR grew up as a little boy in Manhattan. His dad did not fight in the Civil War, but he did go and work in Washington, D.C., closely with Abraham Lincoln to set up an allotment commission, and he became friends with Abraham Lincoln. So for TR, as a little boy growing up during the Civil War, Lincoln and his father were an important duo. That is, his dad was on the battlefront signing up soldiers to send their pay home. He was working with Abraham Lincoln, and he was a strong Lincoln Republican. So that's an important thing to remember about TR's attachment to Lincoln, but also TR's emerging political and historical consciousness. So having John Hay at his side when he's president, the man who was at Lincoln's side during the Civil War was really important to TR as he embarked on the presidency. He also, to understand TR's historical consciousness, it's important to understand him in the context of fierce nationalism. He was from a Federalist, Hamiltonian political tradition. His dad believed in the central part of the Constitution, centralizing philosophy of the Constitution. His dad was such a strong nationalist that he had erected in New York City a statue of Garibaldi, the unifier of Italy. So it wasn't just nationalism, the centralized state in the United States, but it was also that Theodore Sr. And his son believed that the nation state was the kind of heroic center of the spirit of the state, the spirit of the folk, and that to understand history, you had to understand the rise of nation states, the glory of nation states, the heroes who made them great, so the people who contributed to the national story. TR also had a strange benefit, which is that he was the nephew of one of the Confederate founders of the Confederate Navy. James Bullock was his uncle, and he visited him as a young man. As he traveled around Europe, he went to see Uncle James Bullock. Well, you can imagine what historical lesson one of the founders of the Confederate Navy would give his nephew, which is prepare. One of the problems of the Confederate Navy is you invent a nation instantly and you don't have naval building programs behind you. So it's very hard to have a Navy. And James Bullock was a big, for the rest of his life, he had to live in exile in England, but he would say to his nephew, Theodore Roosevelt, preparedness is key to the state's survival. Obviously, the Confederacy did not survive, and he did pretty well, James Bullock, as a Confederate naval leader, but they didn't have much time to prepare militarily. So that becomes one of the central issues for TR, the military heroes he honors. He says in his autobiography, "These are the great people of my life. I read about them as a boy. I was related to military heroes in history, mostly Southern, and nationalism is the great story of history and the rise of the nation state." So TR's father was wealthy enough to take him around Europe to show him and to other countries. So TR grows up with a great sense of geography, history, speaks several languages, and he becomes a historian even in college. When he was at Harvard, he sets out to write his first history. And again, the romance of rising nation states, conquering weaker states, and the spread of civilization are the worthy subjects for his histories. His first book is The Naval War of 1812. Guess what? Preparedness is a high value, and who are the villains of this story? Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were not defenders of preparedness. The British could come and burn Washington because the United States got into a war without really being prepared. So TR calls Thomas Jefferson's criminal folly one of the major features of the War of 1812. Although he celebrates naval heroes, and he preaches preparedness in this book. Now, even today, the U.S. Navy has this book in many aircraft carriers, and it's important text because it's a description of battles and how the Navy won them. But TR didn't stop there. He read Gibbon, Parkman, Motley, Prescott, and wrote an epic history of the winning of the West, the early Kentucky-Tennessee West, not this part of the West. And in it, he tells the heroic story of the movement westward of English-speaking people who he assumes to have a natural affinity for democracy. He sometimes uses the word race, but it's not what we would consider scientific race. It's English-speaking people are naturally more democratic in his view. And they believed, he believed that the spread of civilization was the heroic story in the 4 volumes of this tale. So that means he took a view that we've heard earlier today, which is that if people didn't have deeds, Native Americans had no right to the land. So he accepted that view. He accepted the view that Mexicans had no right to the land. He accepted that the English-speaking people who moved west had the right to take the land. He also had the view that the Gilded Age, when he grew up, was troubled by moral decadence, affluence, feebleness, and that, in fact, American men were becoming weaklings. And he and Henry Cabot Lodge co-authored a boys' book of history, which is called Hero Tales from American History. And in the preface, they say, America will cease to be a great nation whenever her young men cease to possess energy, daring, and endurance, as well as the wish and the power to fight the nation's foes. So he assumes that the core of nationhood is fighting qualities, and he feared that Americans were losing them. So in his famous 1899 speech, The Strenuous Life, he warns against Americans feeling too mired in ignoble ease, and that they seek a higher life, a goal of true national greatness. And he asks later on in his inaugural address in 1905, is America a weakling to shrink from the world work of great world powers? So when we understand TR's kind of world consciousness, he wants the United States to become a greater world power and to have fighting virtues and to accept the challenge of fighting among other nations for preeminence. So these themes come out in his early writings. He writes The Rough Riders, that's another history, but he's a major character in his own book, and so it's a fairly self-serving history, which is a history of the battle in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. Most people in this audience probably know that Theodore Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was a strong advocate for the United States to get into the Cuban War for Independence against Spain. And he became a war hero in the Spanish-American War. That's how he rose to fame, to the governorship of New York, and then the vice presidency and the presidency. So his historical consciousness is very much one of fighting and dominance and the expansiveness of civilization. One of the things he also did in his writing of history is to explore his own views of democracy. In Gouverneur Morris, he wrote about a Federalist who was fairly anti-democratic, who was a little bit like Hamilton in saying, I'm not sure about these people, I'm not sure they're capable of voting. But TR criticized Morris and also criticized the Federalists who complained about the War of 1812 and talked secession. For him, secession talk was treason and uncategorical about that. So we get a strong nationalist, and TR has two models of nationalism that he can choose from. Actually, there are more nationalisms floating around in the nationalistic 19th century. One is Lincoln as a model of nationalism based on democracy representing people, but it's also Lincoln, the wartime president, taking power expansively as president in order to save the nation. So Lincoln, as TR's great hero, is a model of nationalism and presidential power, but Lincoln also taught TR to believe that democracy in the United States rested on the goodness of the plain people. So TR often praised the fact that Lincoln had grown up dirt poor and yet educated himself and had become much more than a thoughtful voter, one of the great presidents, TR would say the greatest president. And Lincoln democracy of the plain people, was a particular kind of nationalism for TR. Another kind of nationalism that was floating around in the 19th century that TR read, he studied in Germany, was Heinrich von Treitschke, who argued for the nation state as a moral community that shaped national character, and the danger of a national community was that it had to fight feebleness in people's character, and this German historian argued that war would purify a nation of its crass materialism, and that it would teach political idealism to youth by enlisting them in a war and allowing them to sacrifice their lives for the good of the nation state. So this is a German historian who argues that the nation state is up here and the individuals are elevated by their devotion religiously to this nation state. So hero worship and devotion to the nation state are the core of this kind of German nationalism. He often is cited as one of the precedents for the Nazi movement because he believed the Aryans were the repository of great character and that Jews were unwelcome outsiders in the German state. Now, historians who've studied the various types of nationalisms of the 19th century often miss the fact that TR accepted many of the German historians' ideas. Feebleness, decadence cured by war, the rising of the nation state as a heroic drama, and the individual owing duty to the nation state. But TR accepts only some of those theories, and Lincoln actually helped him move away from the racialism of that type of nationalism. But before we move away from the choice between Lincolnian nationalism and this German historian's nationalism, we have to admit that TR, as a late 19th century nationalist, accepted some of the racial characteristics that seem to attach themselves to nationalism in the late 19th century. One is that he often wrote about the Anglo-Saxons' capacity for democracy. In his historical writings, he also complained about priest-ridden peoples, meaning Catholics, of course, and he complained about the half-savage Negroid Haitians who he believed were unready for self-government. So let's be clear that TR, unlike Lincoln, I believe, has a nationalism that's tinged with racialism, but he's not where the Germans were. So I think that's important as we place him, that we understand that he was pulled towards Lincoln's nationalism and let go of some of the racialism that is attached to his belief in the strong nation state. He loved Lincoln's addresses where Lincoln argued for the historical connection between generations, the mystic chords of memory, history connecting the Revolutionary generation with the Civil War generation. That to TR seemed like the government would be a benign collective enterprise, teaching high ideals, justice, and democracy, and that the purpose of the Civil War was to give a rebirth to freedom. All of those Lincoln ideas TR accepted. So as TR was thinking about the presidency, he always thought of Lincoln as the best president. He saved the Union, he re-articulated American nationalism, and he also showed a kindness and a concern for plain people. All right, so fast forward to 1901. TR is climbing a mountain as usual, and he hears that President McKinley has been shot. He's the vice president. He's called to Buffalo. He takes office. The first night he's in the White House, what does he do but talk about his father and Lincoln? He sits with his sisters and says, let's remember how close our family was to presidential greatness once. Our father was like this with Lincoln. So you can see this young president taking office and having John Hay close to him, having Lincoln's memory close to him. John Hay, when TR was inaugurated after being elected in 1904, gives TR the Lincoln hair to wear in a ring as Lincoln's blessing upon TR's presidency. So we have not only a link between two presidents that's really important. TR was also guided by Lincoln. Now, I'm not a person who believes in spiritualism or ghosts or anything, but John Hay could say, well, TR, Lincoln said this to me, and he was sitting right there with TR. So it was a connection between these two presidents. Well, many of you know what that means. It means that TR enunciates a theory of the presidency that's called the stewardship theory of the presidency. And in his autobiography, he says, basically, it's Lincoln nationalism. And it's the Constitution doesn't ban it, I'm doing it. So Lincoln had the excuse of the Civil War, which is if you have Confederates tearing down your bridges and trying to, and attacking troops as they're coming through Baltimore, you have an excuse of major magnitude for expanding presidential power. TR did not really have a civil war. He had the U.S.-Philippines War, which he liked to keep quiet, and which he declared done after the scandals of the waterboarding and the really torture and genocide that was going on there. And he didn't like to think about that war very much. Basically, he argued for the stewardship theory because he wanted to be a strong president like Lincoln, and he didn't really need a civil war to do it. So the modern presidency begins with TR enunciating that theory, practicing very strong presidential mediation in the anthracite coal strike, in the Russo-Japanese War, stepping into issues that presidents hadn't stepped into before. In a pre-Keynesian era, presidents generally did not know much about economics. Nobody knew much about economics, but he stepped into the panic of 1907 and recapitalized those banks and basically said, Constitution didn't say I couldn't do it, so I'm doing it. So we're getting a kind of strong modern presidency. He also realizes that publicity is terribly important to get the word out about what he's doing and why. So he has a press room, he jollies up the press, he invites them in, he embraces them, and he has favorites. You write a good story about TR, you're welcome to come talk to him when he's shaving. If you write a bad story about TR, too bad you don't get your pass. Now, TR and imperialism is what we often associate with him, and certainly if you're going to think, did his historical consciousness directly imprint itself on his presidency? Well, yes, it does. He's a strong president. He loves Lincoln. He likes strong leaders. He believes in military strength, preparedness. Those all come into his presidency. He builds battleships. He strengthens preparedness. He expands the government. He gets area desks in the State Department. Believe it or not, America had one of the weakest and least knowledgeable State Departments before TR was there. He does modernization. He's a modernizer and an expander of the government. And so what he does is to take the presidency and do quite a number of things, but he learns from the Philippines incident and the scandal about the waterboarding that the United States does not really have an appetite to be British Empire Part 2, that there's not a sustained national appetite for imperialism. So he's going to have to give that up. It's not that he doesn't believe those things, it's just he thinks it's not politically possible. So what we see in TR is the historical consciousness of great men and great nations rising informs his judgments, but like Lincoln, he's a cagey politician. He's only going to do what he can get away with. And he presses it sometimes on conservation, which he doesn't get from Lincoln. He expands the national parks, he expands the forests. Congress won't give him the enabling legislation to do all he wants. So he uses the Antiquity Act and executive orders. So he becomes kind of the king of executive orders. We're going to save this, we're going to have game preserves. He uses the Antiquities Act to save the Grand Canyon. Now, I personally think it was a great idea, but as we look back on the modern presidency and we see the historical drift of the presidency, we can see this is a moment when the president is saying, try and stop me. Just try and stop me. He's pretty unstoppable on these things. Now, on conservation, I think he was absolutely right, but do we approve of expanded presidential power for good things when in fact it gives permission to later presidents to do whatever they want? So TR is a complicated example of the expansion of historical powers. Now because I don't want to go over time, and I may have already, TR doesn't ask Congress about sending battleships to make the Panamanian Revolution succeed, which is he wanted the Panama Canal built, and he wasn't going to ask Congress if he could send those battleships. Now, foreign policy powers clearly are an area. As commander-in-chief, the Constitution says, you're commander-in-chief. It means that you call out the army when the country's in danger. Well, who decides when that danger is? Well, that's one of the questions for the 20th century presidency. It's a question even today. And I think on some levels, constitutional limits on presidential foreign policy making is kind of a lost cause. They tried after Nixon with the War Powers Act, and since then it's been pretty hard to have congressional limits on presidential power. So he gets the Panama Canal. TR's proudest act as president is he combines the Atlantic and the Pacific. That's pretty big. They're still using that canal today. He settles the Russo-Japanese War, and his knowledge as a historian really helps him there, which is that many Western politicians were very dismissive of the Japanese. They're short, we don't know them, they're of a different race, we're not going to give them respect. That was typical of diplomats in 1905. TR knew about, he liked the Japanese. They're a warrior people. They had all this samurai tradition he loved as a person who admired military might. And his respectful treatment of Japanese diplomats helped settle that terrible war. But he also brings to his presidency some of this racialism that I talked about. So he doesn't do much for African Americans, a little bit of partisan political appointment. He accidentally has dinner with Booker T. Washington and creates a lot of, he doesn't really do that as a planned policy. He says he believes in the square deal, every man on his merit, equal opportunity, but it's not clear that he's able to do much as president. And in Brownsville, there was in Brownsville, Texas, a shooting, and he blames, without really any evidence, black soldiers for that and dismisses them with dishonorable discharges. So historians today look at that as an example of his racial views coming to his presidency. But in other ways, TR puts the United States on the map as a major world power, not just by military means. Diplomatic negotiations, settlement of wars. He settles the Moroccan crisis. He sends aid to Italy during this terrible earthquake in Sicily. He insists that Latin America gets included in the International Court of Justice. Now, historians debate, was it a good thing or a bad thing to send the American Navy, all of it, around the world to display American military power? Some people argue that, in fact, it guaranteed the peace because people would be afraid to challenge the United States. Other people argue that it encouraged naval buildups, which were happening anyway, because people were afraid that there was a coming war. Well, Abraham Lincoln, he admired very much for his ability to use the bully pulpit, which is to use the presidency to define the future of America and use rhetoric and eloquence and persuasion to change people's minds. Now, the classic moment of that is the Emancipation Proclamation, which is that Lincoln knew that slaves were running away to the Union lines anyway, and that slavery was really ending as he spoke. And there were also congressional actions that had been taken towards ending slavery. But the Emancipation Proclamation is this moment of persuasion and stating, we're done with this. Slavery has to end, and these are the reasons. We have to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. TR, in looking at Lincoln, always wanted his own moment of moving the country forward and being a great nationalist president who could say, I took America from this stage and moved it to this stage by persuasion. But as a president, perhaps he moved it forward as a world power. He had some successful antitrust action. Certainly with rhetoric, he kind of laid the ground for later progressive reform that that Wilson picked up. I have often thought that there's an argument to be made that TR softened up the body politic for certain kinds of progressive reasoning, and that Wilson stepped in and did what he did because TR had made it possible. I would argue that TR's Emancipation Proclamation moment is in 1912. Now, he starts giving speeches in 1910 called the New Nationalism. We're going to rise to a higher level of a compact between the nation state and its citizens by saying that the nation state is going to argue for economic justice. So in his New Nationalism speech in 1910, he argues that property is less important than labor, which is a quotation from Abraham Lincoln. He mentions Lincoln 7 times. And then in 1912, he argues, again using Lincoln all the time, that the United States needs economic nationalism, which is to say, other countries are doing it. He was very much aware that European nations were providing safety nets. He believed that the United States could thwart the rise of socialism and respond to some of the demands of the labor movement by having unemployment insurance, old age pension, workman's compensation, ending child labor, and doing many of the things that we today call a welfare state. He proposed that in 1912 and was called a communist for it because that seemed too radical in 1912. Well, in fact, TR used his political capital in 1912 to argue for a higher level of nationalism, that is, a nation state that works for the benefit of the people economically. An idea that's in Lincoln's thought and that's floating around in other countries in 1912. So I think at the end of his life, he was proud to influence Frances Perkins, the mother of Social Security, one of his proteges. He was proud to influence Eleanor Roosevelt, his niece. He was proud to influence, he loved Franklin Roosevelt, his nephew by marriage and distant cousin. TR's understanding of history obviously informed his presidential decision-making. Does TR's love of the fierce and generous nation-state provide any model for today's world? That's a question for us, which is our generation has to decide, can we still afford a government that protects with regulation, that offers this safety net? How devoted are we to that vision of the nation state? Because that was TR's fierce nationalism, saying American citizens would fight and die for a republic that took care of them. Today, politicians sometimes dismiss the welfare state as the nanny state. TR would consider it the daddy state. A good father takes care of the women and the children and the needy. Only history can judge whether he was a worthy bearer of this type of nationalism. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I think this is, Tom, is this the third time I've been down here to speak? I always have a great time here, and I want to thank Tom, I want to thank Jeff, I want to thank everybody here. I'm delighted to be here. Kathy, I certainly do agree with you that, that TR did soften up the body politic for Wilson's accomplishments. In some ways, I think for progressivism, TR was Moses and Wilson was Joshua. He was the conqueror. I've entitled this, this paper, A Scholar and His Ghosts. Now, I have several things in mind with that title. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was a scholar. In fact, he's the only professional scholar we've ever had as president, our only PhD president. And I think that distinguishes him, too, from, I think, the man who was an even more prolific historian, definitely. I think Theodore Roosevelt has that hands down. I mean, he wrote more history and more serious history, certainly much more than Wilson did. I'll say something about Wilson as a historian in just a minute. And then ghosts. For such an educated man, Wilson could be, to some of us, surprisingly superstitious, and I'm going to mention that too. But ghosts are also the historical figures from the past who inform us, who haunt us, who shape us, and I think that's what's very important here. I'll give you the best evidence of it that I have found. On the night of April 2nd, 1917, when he came back to the White House after delivering the address to Congress asking for the declaration of war, he was riding up in the elevator, and he remarked to his young cousin, Fitz Woodrow, "Fitz, thank God for Abraham Lincoln. I won't make the mistakes that he did." Well, yeah, that's interesting. Of course he was going to liken himself to Lincoln. He just asked Congress to plunge the nation into the biggest and bloodiest conflict since the Civil War. And if you read Wilson's war address, which, forgive me, I think is the finest presidential speech since Lincoln's second inaugural, it is Lincoln-esque in its somber beauty. And near the close, he practically lifted a sentence from Lincoln when he said, There are, it may be, many months of fiery toil and sacrifice ahead of us. And there's plenty to link him to Lincoln. He admired Lincoln, just like TR. He admired Lincoln more than any of his predecessors in the White House. And in the 1912 campaign, actually, it had been a tug of war between him and Theodore Roosevelt for the mantle of Lincoln. By the way, this is also a contest between two future presidents of the American Historical Association, the two U.S. presidents who've been presidents of the AHA. Now, it's interesting, though, which Lincoln? For TR, it was the savior of the Union. For Wilson, it was the apotheosis of the self-made man. Great emancipator, neither of them talked about it a bit. So in many ways, sure, Lincoln, of course, Lincoln was on his mind. Now, what did he mean, though, by I won't make the mistakes that Lincoln did? Well, I've read through his writings and speeches, and frankly, he had never said much about Lincoln as a war leader. And in his book that covered the Lincoln presidency, Division and Reunion, 1829-1889, which was published in 1893, he contented himself with talking about Lincoln's actions with not too much analysis or criticism, certainly of his military policies. And this was true also in his other big work of history, a grandiloquent four-volume work called History of the American People, published in 1902. Lincoln, again, was a thoroughly admirable figure, not much about him as commander-in-chief. The best explanation I've been able to come up with comes from the son of the man to whom he made it, Fitzwoodrow. Tony and I know Colonel Fitzwoodrow, U.S. Marines retired. Fitz told me that his father said to him that the president meant that he was going to pick one commanding general and stick with him and not switch around the way Lincoln had done. Well, the younger Woodrow was a career Marine officer, and he added that Wilson's resolve in that regard was never tested because the war was so short and American forces really didn't fight the Germans all that long. That explanation rings true to me because Lincoln, during our belligerency in World War I, Wilson, we both do that, don't we, Kathy?
We do.
He really took a largely hands-off stance toward military matters. He left the ground war to the generals, and they were grateful. Naval matters and war aims were quite a different story. Now, Lincoln was not the only presidential ghost who was haunting Wilson during World War I. In fact, his first reference to a predecessor came in September 1914. This is when the British had just begun instituting their blockade, and that was going to cause frictions, of course, with us as an exporting nation. Well, Colonel House, the Texan, who was his confidant and advisor, never, I think, as important to Wilson as House thought he was, but that's another story, said that Wilson pulled down a volume from that History of the American People, talking about how Madison's circumstances that led to the War of 1812 were quite similar to what they might see coming up with this British blockade. And Wilson called Madison a peace-loving man who desired to do everything to prevent going to war, but popular feeling made that impossible. And Wilson added, Madison and I are the only two Princeton men who have become president. The circumstances of the War of 1812 and now run parallel, and I sincerely hope they will not go further. So what Wilson wanted to do was to avoid Madison's fate, and this led to several consequential actions at the beginning of World War I. One was that famous statement calling on the American people to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in deed. What he wanted to do, this is a very deliberate policy, of trying to damp down popular feeling. Because remember, the height of European immigration to the United States was then, really 1914, right then was the peak of it. For the previous 30 years, it was a true flood of immigrants from Europe, more and more from Southern and Eastern Europe. Much more so now. I mean, we think immigration is so huge now. Oh, no. They face much more of an influx of immigrants. Many of them, of course, most of them had come from countries that were fighting now in World War I. And he was very worried, as a lot of people were, that their ancestral ties, their blood ties, their family ties would inflame them and make them partisan. So he's deliberately trying to damp down popular feeling. The other thing he did was he, along with all of his advisors, made a decision not to mount a forceful legal challenge to the British blockade, which we could have done. We were very much within our rights to do it. What he wanted to do was make sure that we did not have a situation where we were doing something that would get us into a situation where we would have conflict, serious conflict with Britain over the blockade. Now, this has often been said that it was because Wilson was partial to the British. He was pro-Allied. His mother, in fact, had been born in England. All his parentage, in fact, was Scottish, Scotch-Irish. But and he did express some sympathies. He said something to the British ambassador around this time about how he thought it would be terrible if the Germans won the war. But it wasn't sympathies here. It was wanting to avoid Madison's fate. He did not want us to get into this kind of conflict. And at that time, our reaction to the British blockade, we saw as strictly a bilateral matter. It's us and the British. The Germans aren't involved in it. They don't start using the submarines for another 3 or 4 months. So we see this strictly as between us and ourselves, and it's a matter of not buying unnecessary trouble. All of his advisors supported this, including William Jennings Bryan, who has never been accused of any kind of pro-Allied sympathies. Now, Wilson had something else also, another historical reckoning that he made right around there. This involves Mexico. In August 1914, he basically slapped down his belligerent-minded Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, slapped him down for entertaining ideas about intervening in Mexico. We shall have no right at any time to intervene in Mexico to determine the way in which Mexicans are to settle their own affairs. Now, he said that, sure, the Mexicans might do many things that we wouldn't like, but that was their business. There are, in my judgment, no conceivable circumstances which would make it right for us to direct by force or by threat of force the internal processes of what is a profound revolution, a revolution as profound as that which occurred in France. All the world has been shocked ever since the time of the revolution in France that Europe should have undertaken to nullify what was done there, no matter what the excesses committed. Now, that's a revealing statement. Over the next couple of years, that resolve of Wilson's would be sorely tested, such as in Pancho Villa's raid in Columbus, New Mexico. But Wilson was absolutely determined, if at all possible, not to get involved in a war in Mexico. And in May 1916, he told Ray Stannard Baker that he was basing his Mexican policy upon one of the most deeply seated convictions of his life. I'm quoting here. His shame as an American over the first Mexican War and his resolution while he was president that there should be no such predatory war. This has actually been a rather recent sentiment on his part, because in his earlier histories he hadn't said much about that one way or the other. But when it comes to that slogan in his reelection in 1916, he kept us out of war, that really referred much, much more to Mexico rather than to Europe. Now, another thing that's interesting here is his comparison with the French Revolution. Like most educated people in the English-speaking world, the view of the French Revolution was shaped by A Tale of Two Cities and then reinforced by the Paris Commune of 1870. These left indelible images of violence, vengeance, anarchy. But he was viewing this with understanding. And what he came away was with a willingness to give revolution a chance, which became a guiding principle, not only with Mexico, but later with Russia. Now, what makes this view of the French Revolution on his part still more remarkable is he was a disciple of Edmund Burke. And not only, sure, I mean, Burke, of course, was the great critic, condemner of the French Revolution, but Wilson's understanding of Burke went deeper than that. He had absorbed, somewhere in the early 1890s, the essence of Burke's vision of anti-ideological politics. That is, politics as a form of life, and not something that can be mapped out by theory and by plans and designs. What he was doing here really was anticipating by about half a century Daniel Bell and others who wrote of the end of ideology. And he really talks about the power of growth. This is interesting, I think, because when it comes to foreign policy, he came back to this. In 1918, he told a group of foreign journalists, he cited Burke by name and told them that his definition of free government, following Burke, was a government which those under it will guard. He assured the journalist, now there isn't any one kind of government under which all nations ought to live. There isn't any one kind of government which we have a right to impose on any nation. So that I am not fighting for democracy, except for the peoples who want democracy. Those words were off the record. God, I wish they'd been on the record, because they wouldn't be published again until the papers, Tom, Arthur Link in the papers. This would be about 60 years later. So much ink would be spilled about how Wilson was a hypocritical imperialist, a utopian visionary who was going to spread democracy around the world no matter what. No, he was not, and he said so himself. One question I want to ask here, and there's the comparison with Theodore Roosevelt as a historian. Someone might ask, well, really, how much of a historian was Wilson anyway? Some ways you could say not much. His large output of published work includes only really 3 purely historical works. There was Division and Reunion, which I mentioned before, that 4-volume history of the American people. That was a knockoff, by the way, and one of his Princeton colleagues later called it a gilt-edged potboiler. He was exactly right. Wilson claimed he did it to learn some more American history for his projected magnum opus that he was going to write, about to write when he became president of Princeton, but actually he got a heck of a lot of money for it. His royalties from A History of the American People amounted in today's dollars to $1 million. That's not bad. I've never gotten any royalties like that. Jim, have you? I don't know anybody else gotten that kind of money. Only Division and Reunion really stands up as much of a work of scholarship. It's a nicely written narrative. It's a synthesis. There's not a lot of primary research in there. Wilson didn't like primary research, archive digging. He got an exposure to that as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, and he hated it. He absolutely hated it. And in his own estimation, the chief strength of Division and Reunion lay in his viewpoint, because he believed he was transcending sectional biases. He believed he could view the Civil War impartially, because despite his birth and upbringing in the South, he didn't have deep roots there. His mother had been born abroad. His father had been born in Ohio. They'd both grown up in Ohio, gone to the South shortly before Wilson's birth. And this I find most interesting. He said, this is talking to the editor of the series in which that book appeared, ever since I have had independent judgments of my own, I have been a Federalist. By that, he meant a devotee of Hamilton, and rejected the state rights, limited government credo of the former Confederacy. In other words, he believed in strong centralized government. In fact, in 1912, when TR tried to pin the state rights limited government tale on Wilson, he brushed it aside beautifully, because it wasn't true. He was just as much a Hamiltonian, just as much a devotee as TR ever was. And he had early on rejoiced in the defeat of the Confederacy and in the demise of slavery. I won't get into his racial views. We can talk about that later. But Lincoln ranked above all in his estimation of his presidential predecessors, of great Americans. Jefferson did not rank very high. He believed that Jefferson was tainted with theoretical politics. He later came around to a rather more positive view of Jefferson, but that certainly was part of his getting along in democratic politics. He used history to inform his study of politics, just as he would his practice of politics. Now, as a scholar, of course, he was first and foremost what was already being called a political scientist. But listen to this. I do not like the term political science. Human relationships, whether in the family or in the state, are not in the proper sense, any proper sense, the subject matter of science. They are the stuff of insight and sympathy and spiritual comprehension. By the way, he said that in giving a presidential address to the American Political Science Association. He's the only president of the U.S. who's ever headed that organization. He's also one of only two people who's ever headed both the AHA and the APSA. Anybody here know who the other one was? That's correct. Yes, Charles Beard. I think that speaks to something, because in those days, when he came up, the boundaries between political science and history were permeable. Indeed, I think non-existent. The term political history is what we call a retronym. You know, it's like dial telephone, day baseball. Well, yeah, there was a time when what else was there? At Hopkins, in the seminary, as they called it, the room where they met of political and historical studies, they had a motto emblazoned up there. History is past politics, politics is present history. Yeah. I don't think Wilson ever considered that he was ever making a choice between being a historian and a political scientist. He just didn't. To him, these went together hand in glove. They were all part of the same enterprise. The one thing I can have found was that as his academic star rose and he was making Princeton, getting concessions out of Princeton to keep him there, he did insist that he be relieved of his teaching of history so that he could concentrate on the teaching of politics. Other than that, it's the same thing. And as Tom and who else? There's somebody else here. David is we've all have degrees from Princeton. The name of the department there is politics, not political science. That was Wilson's choice. Some other places it's called government. I think that's about the only place it's called politics. Where? Pardon me? Okay, thank you. Good. Good. Well, perfect. As president, I think he drew on both of his scholarly background, all of his scholarly background, to chart his choices. And I think history impinged more in the biggest decision that he ever made, which was to go to war in 1917. Madison's ghost was very much around. Wilson, again, didn't want Madison's fate, but I think he understood very well that he was not in the same position as Madison. Madison, he believed, and I think Madison was in many ways forced into war. Woodrow Wilson was not. From everything I've studied, and others here can support or contradict it, right down to when he went before Congress to speak, and nobody knew what he was going to say. That was a closely guarded secret. There were no leaks, nothing there. Every bit of evidence we have is that both public and congressional opinion was still very much divided, very much in the middle. It was Wilson's to shape either way he wanted to do. And he could have made an eloquent speech to stay out of the war. He chose to go in. He didn't have Madison's problem. Madison had been forced in. Wilson was not forced in, and he knew he wasn't. There was another ghost, though, that I think needs to be brought in here. Not an American, and not somebody of recent history of that time, but a German who had lived 4 centuries before, Martin Luther. This brings in the role of religion in Wilson's thinking. There's been an awful lot that has been written about Woodrow Wilson and religion, and certainly there should be. Son, grandson, nephew, later son-in-law of Presbyterian ministers, born in a manse himself, of course, raised in manses, raised on the campus of a theological seminary. Of course, this was a great influence on him, but not in a simple way. I think, to me, the most telling thing there is that this was Presbyterian. And the Presbyterians then, others may wonder now, but certainly then, were by far the most intellectual of Protestant denominations, and the least evangelical. So that he's raised in that kind of environment. And he himself never wanted to be a minister. This was not anything he ever wanted to do. He didn't believe in mixing religion and politics. It's his great rival who likes the term bully pulpit and who likes to compare presidential leadership to preaching. It's not the minister's son. And Kathy may dispute this, but I think TR was actually a religious skeptic as opposed to a deep believer, which Wilson was. So how did this come in? Well, when the first danger of intervention arose, which is right after the sinking of the Lusitania, Wilson responded to a telegram that implored him to declare war in the name of God by saying to his stenographer, "War is not declared in the name of God. It is a human affair altogether." True. I mean, that's how Wilson came at it at first. But when he actually had to face intervention, it wasn't so simple. He was too good and too orthodox a Christian to believe that he could hear God telling him what to do. I've sometimes said, and forgive me for your neighbor here, but I think he's rather different from somebody we know. As a good Protestant, Wilson knew that all he could do was pray, read Scripture, and think hard in trying to perceive what God's will might be. He also knew that as a human being, he was a sinner, and he knew he couldn't be sure he was carrying out God's will. So what to do? I think this is where Luther came to his aid. For Luther, the Christian must act on faith and Scripture and then do her or his imperfect best to follow in God's way. What he or she could not do was avoid sin. Therefore, we have Luther's famous dictum, sin boldly. I think what Wilson did was to cast our nation, his nation, in the same role as Luther's Christian. This war was the greatest collective sin of human history. One way or another, America could not avoid being a party to that sin. Wilson was asking his fellow citizens to join him in choosing the bolder and what he hoped was the more promising sin of fighting and winning this war in order to try to build a better world in the future. Now, I'm not just being fanciful here. I'd like to think, boy, did I really come up with a great idea of comparing this? No, sorry. I'm picking up on a big, broad hint that Wilson himself dropped. At the end of the war address, following soon after that near quotation from Lincoln and another from the Declaration of Independence, he apostrophized America as spending her blood for her deepest values. She will do this, she must do this. And then come those final words, God helping her, she can do no others. All you have to do is change two words, and that's a repetition of Martin Luther's declaration to the Diet of Worms. God helping me, I can do no other. I think in the end, it was still another ghost from history that guided Wilson to make the decision that did more than anything else to shape the history, our history, from that time on. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Looks like we're running short on time, so I'll be somewhat brief. My task is to talk about FDR, who I think is indisputably the most important president of the first half of the 20th century. His 4 terms in office served to establish a liberal policy trajectory that would stand for 40 years after his death. He transformed American constitutionalism, and he made all who came after him, whether they agreed with him or not, wrestle with his example. But perhaps his most important accomplishment, if it can be called that, remains his least known, and that was that Roosevelt had a supreme ability to sell his policies to the public by making them above all about historical necessity. He was able to shape the historical consciousness of the nation in a way that legitimated his initiatives by offering a series of historical fables that we continue to see today. His rhetorical mastery was evident from the beginning of his quest for the presidency in 1932. In the midst of the Great Depression, then President Herbert Hoover had only, with the greatest reluctance, begun to use the powers of the federal government to address the crisis of the Depression. And he believed that there was really only so much that could be done and still stay within the boundaries of the American political tradition. But then Governor Roosevelt could not have disagreed more. As he looked out over the nation, he saw a rupture between past conditions and the present. Roosevelt's ideas came directly from the progressive thinkers of the prior 30 years. He believed with Walter Whale that a commitment to, in Whale's words, ancient political ideas, which basically meant the ideas of the Founding Fathers, would only encumber our modern brains in addressing contemporary problems. He thought, as Walter Lippmann put it in 1913, that government officials could not hope to meet new challenges with, in Lippmann's words, a few inherited ideas, uncriticized assumptions, a foggy vocabulary, and a machine philosophy, all of which he thought basically the Founding Fathers had. It was only through a new sense of political values, that's Lippmann again, that the burdens of a new time could be met. Roosevelt agreed entirely. The times themselves, Roosevelt had thought had only become more demanding since progressivism's heyday, and the need for new ideas was only more pressing. So Roosevelt set up his entire campaign to broadcast his sense of historical change and his corresponding call for governmental renovation. After he received the Democratic nomination for the presidency, he went against the tradition and asked party leaders to hold the convention in session. Then he got on a plane and flew from New York to Chicago at a time when plane travel was practically unprecedented, and addressed the convention in person, accepting the nomination. When he appeared before the crowd, he acknowledged that his actions were unprecedented and unusual, but they were justified, he said, because these are unprecedented and unusual times. He also wanted it understood that he broke tradition with a frankly symbolic purpose. Let it be from now on the task of our party to break foolish traditions, he told the crowd. Only by doing so would they be able to meet, in his words, the demands of a new time. Yet there was some ambiguity in his address. As much as he called for a break in governing practices, and as much as he promised a new deal for the American people once he was elected, the main thing to come out of his nomination address, he laced his message with a surprising sense of historical continuity beneath his call for change. He invoked, in his words, the continuing logic of history to suggest that the Democratic Party had long been the champion of liberalism and that the party was most now able to conserve American institutions. He claimed that the Democrats had made it a habit to disregard foolish traditions, and yet that they maintained core political ideals. It was by recognizing the inner logic of history, he told the crowd, and by applying old principles in new ways, that the party could continue to uphold what he considered the best of America. What Roosevelt had in mind, though he did not really articulate it fully in his nomination speech, was that principle stood in some sense outside of time and circumstance, in ways that allowed for the constant generation of new intellectual forms and new applications. His break from the past, in other words, was not total. He was not a revolutionary. The fact that he was calling for new government institutions and practices did not mean that old principles were gone. And proposing a new deal for the American people, he claimed, in other words, to be standing within and articulating anew core American values. It was, as he would later say, the new terms of the old social contract that he sought. Once he won election, he continued the theme. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt pledged to work with Congress in the first 100 days to pass a comprehensive program in finance, in commerce, and in agriculture. The idea was to use the full force of the government to fight the Great Depression. But he claimed that such a program would be in keeping with founding principles in this address because, as he explained, the Constitution is so simple and practical that we are able to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. But he also introduced a third perspective in his inaugural address, arguing that the businessman's creed of the past decade had taken the nation off course. He charged business leaders with abandoning core principle. And once the Depression hit, he said, they, in his words, fled from the high seats in the temple of our civilization. Their abandonment now opened up the space for action, he said. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths, he told the crowd. At the center of the old truths was a set of social values that went beyond the profit motive and that drew inspiration from the scriptures and ultimately from Jesus. His rhetoric of restoration worked on a deeper level with the civic republican tradition, which had long affirmed public-mindedness as a core value, and that saw the continual falling away and then return to principle as a kind of fundamental dynamic within the life of a republic. This cyclical sense of time stood in some contrast with his earlier statements. So by his inaugural, what I'm trying to argue is that Roosevelt had three different and not entirely compatible conceptions of historical time. The first was a secular notion of time that emphasized linear development, the progressive and accumulative evolution of social systems over eras, and the corresponding risk of anachronism in governing forms. The second sense of time was a flirtation with timelessness, an assertion that principles stood outside of time and could be appropriated in new ways without violating those principles. The third was the cyclical notion of time that emphasized that principles were promulgated, betrayed, and then restored. Each story had a different strategy of legitimation. The secular notion of time emphasized a disjunction with the past in order to legitimize government action. The assertion of timeless principle freed officials from past constraint, but claimed some tether to tradition. And the cyclical notion of time legitimated action by painting his predecessors as betrayers of core principle that he sought to restore. In the early part of his administration, he stuck with this first story about the tremendous changes of the past and the argument that these changes required a corresponding governmental renovation and reconstruction. But well before the 1936 re-election campaign, Roosevelt was met with resistance. Many businessmen had become concerned about the way that the New Deal was infringing upon their power and profits. As Irénée DuPont of the DuPont Company wrote to a friend, "It must now become clear to every thinking man that the so-called New Deal advocated by the administration is nothing more or less than the socialistic doctrine called by another name." To battle this threat, DuPont enlisted his family and his friends, many business acquaintances, in an extended campaign to bring down first Roosevelt and then the entire New Deal. Their strategy was what they hoped would be a grassroots campaign conducted under the umbrella of a new organization called the American Liberty League. Yet the businessmen realized that they could not just use the League to advocate for the protection of private property. That would turn off the common man in a time of economic depression. So they cast around trying to figure out some way to use this organization. And W.H. Staton, who would become the future secretary of the League, offered up the suggestion that they use what he called a moral or an emotional purpose to justify the organization, something other than the defense of property rights. And he thought he knew of one that would work. This is in a planning memo that I got out of the Hagley Library. "Not many issues," he wrote, "could command more support or evoke more enthusiasm among our people than the simple issue of the Constitution." With all the changes that Roosevelt was doing through the New Deal, he believed that the Constitution could be made to be under threat, that the issue of the Constitution would motivate the common people, and then they could accomplish their goals. He did realize that there was a slight problem. He wrote, "The public ignorance concerning the Constitution is dense and inexcusable. But nevertheless, there is a mighty, though vague, affection for it. The people, I believe, need merely to be led and instructed, and this affection will become almost worship and can be converted into a mass movement." Now, I have to point out that this devotion to the Constitution was entirely a ruse, as Staton himself pointed out. He wanted to change the Constitution in various ways. He admitted in the memo. He, for example, wanted to eliminate the 16th Amendment. He had some other ideas as well. But for the purposes of the 1936 election, Staton suggested, the League needed to act as though, in his words, the Constitution is perfect. "We do not seek to change it, or to add to it, or to subtract from it. We seek to rescue it from those who misunderstand it, misuse it, and mistreat it." Now, Roosevelt immediately saw the problem that the League posed for his political program. And so he faced a choice. He could continue to advocate for changes in secular time and a corresponding need for governmental renovation, but that would essentially play into the League's hands. Or he could do something different. So what he decided to do was to execute what we would today call a pivot. And to accomplish that move, he needed to change his dominant historical posture rather dramatically. He would need to find some way to downplay his sense of secular transformation in order to emphasize his more cyclical vision in which core principles were elaborated, threatened, and then restored. And so after some experimentation, he arrived at his new narrative. His advisors decided to use the 1936 State of the Union address in order to roll it out. In order to maximize the radio audience, he requested the nearly unprecedented, and I say nearly unprecedented because Wilson's war message was the only time that this had happened before, the nearly unprecedented procedure of an evening address to Congress. That way more people would be home and more people could listen to it on the radio. On the night of the event, the chamber was packed. Roosevelt stood before the crowd, braced himself before the microphones, and then told the packed chamber that his goal was the defense of American principle from autocratic threats, both at home and abroad. In the controversy over the New Deal, he said, popular opinion is at war with a power-seeking minority. That is no new thing, he told the crowd. In fact, it had occurred on a cyclical basis since the American Revolution. From time to time since then, he said, the battle has been continued under Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. Successive generations had faced the autocratic threat. Successive generations had overcome it. Seen in the light of that history, his effort in the New Deal was in no way revolutionary, and nor were his struggles new. Instead, they were but the latest battle, in his words, to restore to power those to whom it rightfully belonged. Now, this cyclical view of the past became the dominant theme of his 1936 campaign. Although he occasionally still referenced changes in secular time and emphasized the need for adaptation of governmental forms to new realities, his dominant message was that he fought in a long line of those who were defenders of fundamental principle against those seeking autocratic power. His new story did not try to legitimate governmental action so much as it sought to preserve his accomplishments in the New Deal. But it also moved him well beyond his earlier campaign posture, in which he'd portrayed himself as an anti-Hoover, by placing himself in a long line of people from Jefferson, Jackson, Wilson, and others. He exploited, in the words of Alfred Hawsworth Jones, parallels with the past for his own political advantage. Roosevelt's basic assertion through the 1936 campaign was, as he would put it a few days after his State of the Union address, history repeats. Not history evolves and now we're in a different place, history repeats. The new rhetorical posture was, broadly speaking, largely incommensurate with the one that he adopted in 1932. In 1932, he spoke as a progressive. In 1936, he spoke as a conservative. In 1932, he emphasized a cumulative change and the consequent need for government reconstruction. In 1936, he spoke of perennial battles over principle. At both points, he argued from historical time, but he conceived of that time in different ways. He successfully rode this cyclical vision of history to re-election, but his new rhetorical posture proved to be ultimately unsuccessful. His major legislative accomplishments, though he didn't know it at the time, were largely over, and his new rhetoric was unable to accommodate his ambitions to reconstruct government. He had to continually undersell his goals in order to proclaim his fidelity to the U.S. Constitution. In early 1937, for example, this is shortly after the election, he proposed to reorganize the executive branch, and that desire had long been part of progressive thought. Woodrow Wilson, in particular, had argued that the founders' separation of powers had debilitated the executive, which was particularly problematic given the fast-moving nature of the industrial economy. Roosevelt was now in the position, in other words, to achieve what two generations of progressives had desired. But rather than pointing to the changes in time that made such executive action necessary, he emphasized that his proposal for reorganization was essentially conservative. This is what he said. You and I are taking up in our generation the battle to preserve the freedom of self-government, which our forefathers fought to establish and hand down to us. They struggled against tyranny, against non-representative controls, against government by birth, wealth, or class, against sectionalism. Our struggle now is against confusion, against ineffectiveness, against waste, against inefficiency. to claim that his ambitions could be reduced to the streamlining of administrative processes, and then his organizational efforts and his desire for efficiency were in line with this founder's struggles against tyranny, was, as the political scientist Stephen Skowronek has said, woefully inadequate to his reconstructive ambitions. Roosevelt's loss of rhetorical coherence coincided with his loss of legislative momentum. Although he won a sweeping victory, Congress soon turned hostile and was unwilling to treat his office with the deference of a prime minister in a parliamentary system. As his legislative victories trickled to a stop, he increasingly turned his attentions abroad to address the mounting European crisis. He had succeeded in numerous ways, not least because he was able to draw upon the past for political advantage. His various notions of historical time, that secular processes justified governmental reconstruction, that timeless principle could be applied in new ways, that he took part in a cyclical process in which principles were proclaimed, betrayed, and then restored. Each sought to justify whatever action he wished to take at the moment. But ultimately, as his historical rhetoric became more conservative, while his reconstructive ambitions remained as expansive as ever, the New Deal as a live policy program came to an abrupt end. Thank you so much.
I know we have just a little bit of time. I want to honor your chance to have a little bit of a break before lunch, but if we have just a couple questions, I would love to field those. Got one over here. Aaron, could you?
Is this on?
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, you alluded to Wilson being a racist and said that we might get to that later. But that's something that I had always...
I didn't say that, but...
Oh,
yeah.
okay, I'm sorry. But that's something I'd always been interested in reading about him in connection to some of the things he did or did not do. To what aspect was that? Is it indeed true, and did it play a role in his presidency?
This, as you and I both know, has been in the news a lot, and particularly at my alma mater, Tony Atkins' alma mater, Tom Knox at Princeton. They had proposals to take his name off and that because of his racial views, his actions as president. First of all, Wilson, as I did say briefly, was not much of a Southerner. And in some ways, in terms of deep roots in this country, he wasn't much of an American either. In fact, he's the only president since Andrew Jackson to have no American-born grandparents, and one of just a few, a handful, who've had an a foreign-born parent. He was never comfortable with the idea of being a Southerner. He knew what it was. He'd grown up in the South. And I've characterized his racial views as those that were pretty standard for white Northerners of that time. The distinction is, this is not to say that they were good, or that by many definitions they can and perhaps should be called racist. All that, the trouble with racist is, as soon as you say it, that's a very, very loaded term. The difference was that for white Southerners of just about every persuasion, going from quite obviously and blatantly in the case of James K. Vardaman or Pitchfork Ben Tillman or Tom Watson, you know, these racist demagogues who were deliberately stirring up racial hatreds for political gain and also because they deeply believed in it, all the way over to the very genteel sorts, including members of Wilson's cabinet, such as Josephus Daniels or William Gibbs McAdoo. For them, race was central. It's always there. White Southerners of all persuasions have got these antennae quivering for any kind of challenge that they might perceive to their racial hegemony, which, you know, they had reestablished after Reconstruction. Racial, both social and political hegemony, which, frankly, there wasn't much threat. The white North, by and large, this is where the white North comes in, had pretty much abandoned it. You know, we're tired of that. You know, that's a Southern problem. It'll take care of itself. good people like Booker T. Washington, African Americans will get where they can get with self-help, and yeah, they just as soon forget about it, and impatience. That is largely Wilson's attitude. Now, that's not a good attitude at all, and I never would say that. What happened was he came in, several members of his cabinet were Southerners. I mentioned Josephus Daniels, McAdoo, Albert Burleson from here in Texas, David Houston, also from, no, actually he'd moved to, he was from Texas. He'd moved to Missouri when he was appointed. They were all saying that, Mr. President, our folks down south, meaning our folks, our white folks down south, are really bothered by this. You know, that in the federal government, there are black men supervising white women, which actually was not true. But there were African Americans who had positions of some stature, not all that much, but some stature within the federal government. And it's that, again, this racial mixing is just terrible there. And Wilson said, well, and they said, what we'd like to do is introduce segregation into the federal workplace. Wilson said, and this is to his discredit, well, if you think it's a good idea, give it a try. This is at the beginning of his presidency. They did. It didn't work, at least formally, because the NAACP, finally you've got a black, not exclusively black, but black-led civil rights movement that is now able to kick back, raised a lot of protest, so they called a halt to it. That's formally. Informally, yes, the federal workplace was segregated. And I think what's more telling and more damning is the percentage and the level of employment for African Americans in the federal workplace declined, shrank. Now, when you talk about race and racial politics and racial policies then, you have to broaden it out. And this, you know, this then gets into the accusation that you're whitewashing Wilson by saying, so's your old man. Well, let's look at the Republicans. The Republicans did not have a white Southern constituency, which the Democrats did. They could very well, if they had chosen, try to become competitive in the South. They want very much to be competitive, politically competitive in the South. And you get, from Hayes through Hoover, you get different overtures by the Republicans to establish a political base in the white South. Republicans could have become very competitive in many southern states if they had renewed, at least in some limited political terms, Reconstruction. In other words, try to guarantee the right to vote. They chose not to do this. This is something they didn't have to do. By the way, the Republicans were solidly entrenched thanks to a solid North. The Northeast, the Midwest, and a nice little icing on the cake on the Pacific coast. The two parties, by the way, have switched their constituencies, literally. You know, the blue state, red state thing was just the opposite in those days. The Republicans, when they came back to power in the 1920s, guess what? Those policies, those levels of employment stayed exactly the same. So this is not a proud chapter. One other thing, and I'll quit. The Birth of a Nation. Wilson did a favor to a guy he'd known back in grad school, Thomas Dixon, who wrote the novels, the scurrilous novels that Birth of a Nation was based on. And Wilson was a movie fan himself. Movies are a new industry, you know, you want to help it out. So they did the showing. Wilson, by the testimony we have, didn't pay much attention to the movie and left about halfway through. And he never gave that endorsement, written by lightning. A Hollywood publicist invented that 20 years later. And later he discouraged Griffith from trying to revive the movie. You know, remember the old days when movies would have their run and then they would be gone for a while and then there'd be a revival. You know, Gone with the Wind was every 6 or 7 years or something like that. Wilson tried to discourage that. So his record is not good, but he did, by the way, in 1918 denounce lynching, the first president to come out and really make a powerful statement against lynching. Kathy mentioned Booker T. Washington getting invited to the White House by Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson, a few months later, invited him to Princeton to his inauguration as president of Princeton. So his record, it's not good. Of course it isn't. But he shouldn't be made into an ogre, which he wasn't.
We're going to have one more back here, and then we might have some announcements before lunch.
Thank you for three wonderful papers indeed, and certainly three wonderful historians talking about three wonderful presidential historians. I want to ask a question of Professor Sahat, though, looking at the very end of Roosevelt's life. And one of the crowning achievements of his life, of course, is his design and his advocacy for the United Nations. And I'm curious that that Roosevelt has always discussed completing Wilson's failed mission, in a sense, of accomplishing that which Wilson could not, which was getting the United States into some form of international organization at the end of a world war. And I've never been able to piece out for myself how much of that is heartfelt on Roosevelt's behalf, that it is a heartfelt desire to complete the mission of the man who was his president when he was in his cabinet in World War I, and how much of that is simply just playing fast and loose with a useful political historical tool. Do you get a sense that that Roosevelt was particularly concerned with finalizing Wilson's mission, or is this simply just good politics?
I don't really have an answer for you, because the deeper I go into Roosevelt, the less I can get a sense of what it is that he actually wants, because he's just a master at deploying rhetoric. And you know, what did he mean when he proposed the New Deal? No idea. What was his position on anything at any given moment? I have no idea. You know, he wanted to do something, but the specifics and the rhetoric seemed to come fast and furious and be kind of justified by the moment. And that's part of what makes him so good. And I'm sure others might have a different sense, but I have no idea.
May I come in here? Jeff, I think the simpler answer, which would be insufficient, would be that this was more a useful political ploy for him. My sense of them, you know, as David just said, FDR, the young FDR, had served in the Wilson administration, and he also was married to TR's niece and was a sixth cousin by fifth cousin by blood, nephew by marriage. Yes. So he's in this interesting, somewhat unique position of, in some ways, he's the political heir, legatee to both of them. Of the two, I think Theodore Roosevelt was much more important to FDR than Wilson was, because I think it's just, it's not only the ties of social class, kinship, and the rest of that, but I think there's a fundamental approach of wanting to be a national leader of the nation as opposed to a leader of a coalition, as Wilson did, politically, domestically. And on the international scene, I think that's TR. I think he wants to be one of the great power, it's the great power directorate. The UN is not a reincarnation of the League of Nations. It's just not the same kind of organization that Wilson used to say, without Article 10, the League of Nations would be a mere debating society. Sounds like a pretty good description of the UN to me.
It's kind of the League of Nations with the lodge reservations built into it. That's pretty much what the UN Charter is.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Can we thank our panelists one more time together? Now, I believe we have lunch over here, so let's all take a few minutes to go ahead and grab lunch, take a break, and then in about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have our lunch presentation. Thank you.